70. The world economy of the 19th century. How did the swelling population of Europeans manage to feed itself? How, in fact, did it not merely feed itself but enjoy an incomparably higher standard of living in 1900 than in 1800? The answers to such questions varied in the different regions of Europe, but the overall advance came through the new science, industry, transportation, and communications, and also through the expansion of global trading systems. At the same time, Europeans were developing new business, financial, and labor organizations that contributed to a steady growth in economic productivity. 1063. The New Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution and the global economy entered upon a new phase, which is often called the New or Second Industrial Revolution. The use of steam power, the growth of the textile and metallurgical industries, and the advent of the railroad had characterized the earlier era of industrialization. Now, after 1870, new sources of power were tapped. The already mechanized industries expanded, new industries appeared, and industry spread geographically. The steam engine itself was refined and improved. By 1914, it still predominated over other power machinery, but electricity, with its incomparable advantages, came into use. The invention of the internal combustion, or gasoline, engine and the diesel engine gave the world automobiles, airplanes, and submarines in the 2 decades before 1914. The advent of the automotive and aviation industries made oil one of the most coveted natural resources. In the new chemical industries, industrial research laboratories were replacing the individual inventor. Chemists discovered new fertilizers and from coal tar alone produced a bewildering array of new products ranging from artificial food flavors to high explosives. With explosives, the first great tunnels were built, the Mount Cenis in 1873, the Simplon in 1906, both in the Alps, and great new canals, the Suez in 1869, the Kiel in 1895, the Panama in 1914. Chemistry made possible the production of synthetic fabrics like rayon, which revolutionized the textile industry. Electricity transformed all indoor and outdoor lighting, making cities both brighter and safer. There was a communications revolution, too. The telephone appeared in the 1870s, and the Italian inventor Guglielmo Marconi helped to bring the continents closer together when he successfully transmitted wireless signals across the Atlantic in 1901. Motion pictures and the earliest radios were developed before 1914, leading soon to the production of new popular entertainments that crossed 597 industrial advances, 1064 the traditional social and cultural boundaries of European societies. Medicine ran the alphabetical gamut from anesthetics to X-rays. Yellow fever was overcome. Vastly improved processes for refining iron ore made possible a great expansion in the production of steel, the key product of the new industrial age. Aluminum and other metal alloys were also produced through new industrial processes. Railroad mileage multiplied. The European network, including the Russian, increased from 140,000 miles in 1890 to 213,000 in 1914. In this second phase of the Industrial Revolution, machine industry spread geographically from Britain and Belgium, the only truly industrial countries in 1870, to France, Italy, Russia, Japan, and, most markedly, to Germany and the United States. In Europe, industrial production was concentrated in the inner zone. 3 powers alone, Britain, Germany, and France, accounted in 1914 for more than 7/10 of all European manufactures and produced over 4/5 of all European coal, steel, and machinery. Of the major European powers, Germany was now forging ahead. To use steel alone as a criterion, in 1871, Germany was producing annually 3/5 as much steel as Britain. By 1900, it was producing more, and by 1914, it was producing twice as much as Britain, but only half as much as the new industrial giant, the United States. By 1914, American steel output was greater than that of Germany, Britain, and France combined. Britain, the pioneer in mechanization, was being outstripped in both the Old World and the New. The 3 European powers increased their industrial production by about 50% in the 2 decades before 1914, but the United States had a far higher annual growth rate from 1870 to 1913, 4.3%, as compared to the next leading powers: Germany with 2.9%, Britain with 2.2%, and France with 1.6%. By 1914, the United States had moved ahead of Europe in the mechanization of agriculture, in manufactures, and in coal and steel production, in which it was producing over 2/5 of the world's output. The Americans were pioneering also in assembly line conveyor belt techniques for the mass production of automobiles and all kinds of consumer goods, thereby launching a 20th century industrial challenge to Europe's long-term dominance in the global economy. The industrial powers, 1065 free trade, and the European balance of payments. It was Britain in the mid-19th century, then the workshop of the world, that had inaugurated the movement toward free trade. It will be recalled that in 1846, by the repeal of the Corn Laws, the British embarked upon a systematic free trade policy, deliberately choosing to become dependent upon overseas imports for their food. France adopted free trade in 1860. Other countries soon followed. It is true that by 1880 there was a movement back to protective tariffs, except in Britain, Holland, and Belgium. But the tariffs were impediments rather than barriers, and the economic system, until 1914, increasingly depended on the extreme mobility of goods across political frontiers. Politically, Europe was more than ever nationalistic, but economic activity, under generally liberal conditions in which business was supposed to be free from the political state, remained predominantly international and globe-encircling. Broadly speaking, the great economic accomplishment of Europe before 1914 was to create a financial system by which the huge global imports into industrial Europe could be acquired and paid for. All European countries except Russia, Austria-Hungary, and the Balkan states imported more than they exported. It was the British again who led in this direction. Britain had been a predominantly importing country since the close of the 18th century. Despite 598 imports versus exports, 2066, the expanding export of cotton manufactures and other products of the Industrial Revolution, Britain consumed more goods from abroad than it sent out. Industrialization and urbanization in the 19th century confirmed the same situation. Between 1800 and 1900, the value of British exports multiplied eightfold, but the value of imports into Great Britain multiplied tenfold. And in the decade before 1914, the British had an import surplus of about $750 million a year. Great Britain and the industrial countries of Europe together, roughly Europe's inner zone, at the beginning of the 20th century, were drawing in an import surplus, measured in dollars, of almost $2 billion every year, the dollar then representing far more goods than it came to represent later. The imports into Europe's inner zone consisted of raw materials for its industries and of food and amenities for its people. The Bessemer steelmaking process enhanced the production of steel and rapidly became an important component of industrial expansion during the later decades of the 19th century. Its importance for Britain is suggested by this illustration of the future King Edward VII and Queen Alexandra, who are observing the new methods of steel production from box seats at a factory in Sheffield in 1875. Henry Gutman, Getty Images. How were the imports paid for? How did Europe continue to enjoy a favorable balance of payments despite an unfavorable balance of trade in commodities? Export of European manufacturers paid for most imports, but not all. It was the so-called invisible exports that made up the difference. That is, shipping and insurance services rendered to foreigners, and interest on money lent out or invested, all bringing in foreign exchange and enhancing Britain's position in the global economy. An Argentine merchant in Buenos Aires, for example, to ship hides to Germany, might employ a British vessel. He would pay the freight charges in Argentine pesos, which might be credited to the account of the British shipowner in an Argentine bank. The British shipowner would sell the pesos to someone, in 599 England or elsewhere in Europe, who needed them to buy Argentine meat. The far-flung British merchant marine thus earned global fees that helped to pay for the food and raw materials needed by Britain. To insure themselves against risks of every conceivable kind, people all over the 1067 world turned to Lloyd's of London. With the profits drawn from selling insurance, the British could buy what they wished. Governments or business enterprises on other continents borrowed money in Europe, mainly in England, where the distribution of loans became another important income-producing export. The global interest payments on these loans flowed into European and British banks and helped to finance large quantities of imports. But the lending of money to foreigners was only part of a larger phenomenon, the export of capital. Invisible exports, 1068. The export of European capital. The migration of millions of Europeans had the effect of creating new European-style economies and societies that purchased manufactures from Europe and produced the food and other commodities that were needed in Europe. European nations could not have had such far-reaching international influence if they had exported people only, especially people of such small means as most emigrants were. Europe also exported the capital that enabled the new settlers in overseas societies to develop productive economies. The export of capital meant that an older and wealthier country, instead of using its whole annual income to raise its own standard of living, or to add to its own capital by expanding or improving its houses, factories, machinery, mines, and transportation, diverted some of its income to expanding or improving the houses, factories, machinery, mines, and transportation of foreign countries. It meant that British, French, Dutch, Belgian, Swiss, and eventually German investors bought the stocks of foreign business enterprises and the bonds of foreign businesses and governments. Or they organized companies of their own to operate in foreign countries. Or their banks granted loans to banks in New York or Tokyo, which then lent the funds to local users. Capital arose in Europe to some extent from the savings of quite small people, especially in France, where peasants and modest bourgeois families were notably thrifty. But most capital accumulated from savings by the well-to-do. The owners of a business, for example, instead of spending the company's income by paying higher wages, took a portion of it in profits or dividends, and instead of spending all this on their own living, reinvested part of it in domestic or foreign enterprises. The gap between rich and poor was thus one cause of the rapid accumulation of capital, though the accumulation of capital, in the 19th century, produced in turn a steady rise of living standards for the working classes. In a sense, however, the common people of Western Europe, by forgoing the better housing, diet, education, or pleasures that a more democratic or consumer-oriented society might have provided for them, contributed by their productivity to the export of European capital. Workers benefited from the import of new foods or raw materials, but they also facilitated the financing and building up of other regions of the world. Capital accumulation 600 had given hostages to fortune, and fortune proved unkind, for in the First World War, the British lost about a quarter of their foreign investments, the French lost about a third, and the Germans lost all. 1069. The British were the chief exporters of capital, followed at some distance by the French, and at the close of the century by the Germans. As early as the 1840s, half the annual increase of wealth in Great Britain was going into foreign investments. By 1914, the British had $20 billion in foreign investments, the French had about $8.7 billion, and the Germans had about $6 billion. A quarter of all the wealth owned by the inhabitants of Great Britain consisted in 1914 of their investments outside the country. Almost a sixth of the French national wealth lay in investments outside France. All three by Charles Sheeler, American, 1883 to 1965. Classic landscape. This landscape depicts an American plant of the Ford Motor Company in 1931, but it also symbolizes what has been called the Second Industrial Revolution. In this phase of industrialization, electricity, the internal combustion engine, and the automobile were especially important, and industry spread far beyond its early centers in Britain and Western Europe. The picture is classic in its clear delineation, its array of familiar mathematical forms, and the universality of its message. The plant seems rational and precise, but there are no human beings. It is as if the machine had a life of its own and could do without human hands. National Gallery of Art. 601 with capital obtained from England. In Central and Eastern Europe, British companies often constructed the first railways. then sold out to native operating companies or to governments that subsequently ran them. In 1070, these huge sums, pouring out from Europe's inner zone for a century before 1914, at first went mainly to finance the Americas and the less affluent regions of Europe. European capital was also invested in Asia and Africa, especially after the rapid expansion of Europe's colonial empires in the 1890s. No country except Great Britain completely built its railways with its own resources. In the United States, the railway system was built very largely the Argentine Republic. The British not merely financed and built the railways, but long continued to operate and own them. In addition, up to 1914, the British sold about 75 million tons of coal a year to South America to keep the railways going, not to mention items for replacement and upkeep of equipment. Docks, warehouses, mines, plantations, processing and manufacturing establishments all over the world were similarly built up with capital drawn from Europe. European capital also helped emigrants in the new countries to develop public services and institutions that required major financial investments. In the United States, for example, state and local governments very commonly sold their bonds in Europe to build roads, pave streets, or construct school systems for the westward moving population. A few of these American bonds proved a partial or total loss to European investors, but on the whole, by 1914, the United States had paid back a good deal of its indebtedness. Even so, in 1914, Americans still owed about $4 billion to Europeans, a sum 3 times as large as the national debt of the United States before the First World War. This kind of economic investment, along with the patterns of mass immigration, helps to explain how and why Europe remained deeply involved in distant nations that had long since declared their political independence from European colonial empires. European investors accumulated much wealth through the expanding global financial system of the late 19th century. But this system also helped to develop new industries and infrastructures in faraway places that were virtually unknown to the people of Europe. The new money flowed into and out of European countries at the same time. The recipients of European Capital 71. An international money system, the gold standard. The international economy rested upon an international money system, based in turn upon the almost universal acceptance of the gold standard. England had adopted the gold standard in 1821, when the pound sterling was legally defined as the equivalent of 113 grains of fine gold. Western Europe and the United States adopted an exclusively gold standard in the 1870s. A person holding money in currencies that were deemed to be civilized, pounds, francs, dollars, marks, and the like, could turn it into gold at will, and a person holding gold could turn it into any of these same currencies. The national currencies were like so many different languages, all expressing the same meaning. All had substantially the same value, and until 1914, the exchange rates between currencies remained highly stable. It was assumed that no modern industrial country's currency ever fell. Such things might happen in a remote Latin American republic or in China, or in the French Revolution, but not in the world of modern progress and European affairs. The important currencies were all freely exchangeable. A French merchant selling silks to a German, and hence receiving German marks, could turn the marks into francs, pounds sterling, or dollars. That is, he was not obliged to buy from Germany or spend his money in Germany, but could use the proceeds of his German sale to buy French, British, or American goods or services as he chose. Trade was multilateral. A country needing imports from another country, such as American cotton, did not have to sell to that country to obtain them. It could sell its own goods anywhere and then import according to its needs. Currency exchange. It was the acceptance of the gold standard and the fact that all important countries possessed a sufficient share of gold to support 602 1072 their currencies that made possible so fluid an interchange. At the same time, the gold standard had less wholesome effects. It harmed the economies of countries that lacked gold. And it produced a gradual fall of prices, especially between 1870 and 1900, because until the gold discoveries in South Africa, Australia, and Alaska in the 1890s, the world's production of gold lagged behind the expanding production of industrial and agricultural goods. Persistently declining prices were a hardship to those who habitually worked with borrowed money, many farmers, many businessmen, and debtor nations as a whole. A famous speech by William Jennings Bryan in the United States in 1896, declaring that mankind should not be crucified upon this cross of gold, expressed a common worldwide anger about a financial system that worked against the interests of indebted persons and indebted nations. But falling prices were an advantage to the wage-earning class, which generally improved its position in these years, and also to the wealthy, the owners and lenders of capital, the bankers and financiers, who so long as prices were falling were repaid in money of more value than that which they had lent. Effects of the gold standard. London at the center 1073. The center of the global economic and financial system was London. The London banks prospered in consequence of the defeat of Napoleon, the older financial centers in Amsterdam having been ruined in the Revolutionary and Napoleonic Wars. It may be recalled also that the victors in 1815 imposed upon France an indemnity of 700 million francs, which in 1818 was taken over by a syndicate of private bankers. The London banks played a leading part in this affair, and so developed close connections with many government treasuries. In the Crimean War of 1854-1856, with England at war with Russia, the London banks floated loans for the Russian government. So independent were business and politics at the time. The early adoption of the gold standard in England meant that many people, British and foreign, kept their funds in the form of sterling on deposit in London, where quantities of available capital therefore accumulated. London became the apex of a financial pyramid that had the world for its base. It was the main center for the exchange of currencies, the clearinghouse of the world's debts, the depository from which all the world borrowed, the banker's bank, as well as the world's shipping center and the headquarters of many international corporations. A world market, unity, competition, and insecurity. Never had the Earth been so unified economically, with each region playing specific roles in a global specialization. Western Europe, and in 1870 mainly Great Britain, was the world's industrial workshop. Other parts of the Earth supplied its many needs. An English economist marveled in 1866 that Britain now had its granaries in Chicago and Odessa, its forests in Canada and the Baltic, its sheep farms in Australia, and its gold and silver mines in California and Peru, while drinking tea brought from China and coffee from East Indian plantations. The same could have been said of most of Europe's inner zone nations by the time of the First World War. A true global market. 603 Dow 74. A true global market had been created. Goods, services, commodities, money, capital, and people moved back and forth almost without regard to national boundaries. Articles were bought and sold at uniform world prices. Dealers in wheat, for example, followed prices in Minneapolis, Liverpool, Buenos Aires, and Danzig as reported by telegraph and cable from day to day. They bought where it was cheapest and sold where it was dearest. In this way, the world's wheat supply was distributed roughly according to need or ability to pay. The worker of Milan, if the Italian crop was poor and prices were high, was fed from another source. On the other hand, the Italian wheat grower would in this case feel the pinch of world competition. The world market, while it organized the world into a unified economic system, at the same time brought distant regions into competition for the first time. The producers of goods and commodities, whether entrepreneur, factory employee, farmer, or coffee planter, had no secure outlet for their products, as had generally been true in the past. They were in competition not only with persons across the street or down the road, but also with other producers throughout the world. It was this worldwide system of production and consumption that established the modern economic foundation for what is now called globalization. Export of European capital to 1914. In 1914, the British, French, and Germans held upwards of $30 billion in foreign and colonial loans and investments, distributed as shown on the map. Dutch investments, especially in the West Indies, together with Swiss, Belgian, and Scandinavian holdings, would add several $billion more. Proceeds from such investments helped Europeans to pay for the excess of their imports over exports. British capital predominated in the overseas world, while the less developed regions of Eastern Europe and the Middle East were financed mainly from Germany and France. Much of the investment shown here was lost or expended in the First World War. 604-11075. The creation of an integrated world market, the financing and building up of countries outside of Europe, and the consequent feeding and support of Europe's increasing population were the great triumphs of the 19th century system of unregulated capitalism. The system was intricate, with thousands and even millions of individuals and business firms supplying each other's wants without central planning. But it was extremely precarious, and the position of most people in this network of global economic exchanges was exceedingly vulnerable. Region competed against region and person against person. A fall of grain prices in the American Middle West, besides ruining a few speculators, might oblige German or Argentine wheat growers to sell at a price at which they could not live. Factory owners might be driven out of business if competitors successfully undersold them, or if a new commodity made their own product obsolete. The workers, hired only when needed by an employer, faced unemployment when business slackened or when jobs disappeared because of labor-saving inventions. The system went through cycles of boom and depression, the most notable example of the latter being the Long Depression, that set in about 1873 and lasted to about 1893. The new global economy depended on expansion and on credit, but the declining prices of specific goods or commodities made it impossible for some people to pay their debts, so that credit collapsed, and sometimes expansion failed to keep pace with expectations, and anticipated profits proved to be losses. To combat the essential insecurity of private capitalism, governments, businesses, and workers resorted to all manner of devices. Against competition from other countries, governments established protective tariffs. Business enterprises entered into acquisitions and mergers, sometimes approaching monopolies. For the working classes, governments adopted social insurance measures as protection against accidents, illness, and unemployment. Labor, meanwhile, turned increasingly to its own trade unions and socialist parties. All this signalized the gradual decline in the years after 1880 of 19th century unregulated, laissez-faire capitalism. Cycles of boom and depression, 1076. Changes in organization, big business. A great change came over capitalism itself about 1880 or 1890. Formerly characterized by a large number of small units, small businesses run by individuals, partnerships, or small companies, it was increasingly characterized by large and impersonal corporations. The attractions of the limited liability corporation as a form of business organization and as a means of encouraging investment arose from laws enacted by most countries in the 19th century that limited the individual investor's personal loss in the event of a bankruptcy to the amount of his or her shares of stock in the enterprise. The corporation, in its modern form appearing first with the railroads, became the usual form of 605. The Limited Liability Corporation, 1077 Organization for Industry and Commerce. As machinery grew more complicated, only a large pool of capital could finance it. And as corporations grew in size and number, relying on the sale of stock and the issue of bonds, the influence of banking and financial circles was enhanced. Financiers, using not so much their own money as the savings of others, had a new power to create or to destroy, to stimulate, discourage, or combine corporate enterprises in various industries. Industrial capitalism brought finance capitalism with it. The New World markets and European colonial systems brought about a great expansion in the global production of commodities. During the decades before 1914, the colonized areas of Asia, Africa, and the West Indies exported vast shiploads of tea, coffee, sugar, cocoa, and other commodities to the more industrialized economies of Europe and North America. The Scottish entrepreneur Thomas Lipton, for example, established a highly profitable company that exported tea from the British colony of Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, to global markets. These women were working on a Lipton tea plantation in 1903. They thus participated within colonial Ceylon and with very low wages in a global trading system that was transforming agriculture and daily life throughout the modern world. Print collector Getty image. 606-1078. Corporate organization made it possible to concentrate diverse economic processes under unified management. In retail commerce, large department stores appeared after about 1870 in the United States and France, selling all kinds of goods that were formerly sold only in small shops and establishing a fixed price for each piece of merchandise. In industry, steel offers a good example of the new, large-scale enterprises. Steel became a big business when heavy blast furnaces were introduced. It was not economically safe for the steel business to rely for iron and coal on independent producers. Prices and supplies were often unstable or unpredictable. The steelworks, therefore, began to operate mines of their own or to buy out or otherwise reduce coal and iron mines to subsidiary status. Some, to assure their markets, began to produce not merely steel, but steel manufactures as well: steel ships, railway equipment, naval and military ordnance. Thus, entire processes from mining to finished product became concentrated in a vertical integration. Vertical integration, captains of industry, titans of finance. Many of the new combinations were beneficial in making the ups and downs of business less erratic, and so providing more stable prices and more continuous and secure employment. Generally, they reduced the costs of production, but whether the savings went into higher profits, higher wages, or lower prices depended on numerous factors. Some 1079. In addition to this vertical linking of raw materials and finished products, there was much new horizontal integration in which companies producing the same goods combined with each other to reduce competition and to protect themselves against fluctuations in prices and markets. Some fixed prices, some agreed to restrict production, and some divided up markets among themselves. They were called trusts in the United States, cartels in Europe. They were common in the steel industry and in many other new industries at the close of the century, such as chemicals, aluminum, and oil. It was in the United States that such big business developed furthest, headed by captains of industry and titans of finance. Andrew Carnegie, by origin a poor Scottish immigrant boy, produced more steel than all England, but industrial production in Europe was also increasingly consolidated in large national and transnational cartels. Cartels were greedier than others, or were confronted with only weakly organized or unorganized labor. In any case, for good or ill, decisions rested with management and finance. A new kind of private power had arisen, which its critics like to call feudal. Because no economic system had ever been so centralized up to that time, never, in fact, had so few people exercised so much economic power over so many. The middle class, with the rise of great corporations, came typically to consist of salaried employees. The salaried person might spend a lifetime with the same company and feel toward it, in its disputes with labor or government, a loyalty not unlike that of a lord's retainer in feudal times. The laboring class was less amenable. Labor attempted to organize unions capable of dealing with increasingly gigantic employers. It also, after about 1880, played an increasingly decisive role in the politics of all advanced nations. 607-1080-71. The advance of democracy, Third French Republic, United Kingdom, German Empire. In the years from 1815 to 1870, European political life had been marked by the rise of nationalism and by liberal agitation for constitutional government, representative assemblies, responsible ministries, and guarantees of individual liberties. In the years from 1871 to 1914, the most notable political development was the democratic extension of the vote to working-class men, the adoption of universal male suffrage, which in turn meant for the first time the creation of mass political parties and the need for political leaders to appeal to a wide electorate. Although there was growing agitation for voting rights for women in the decades before 1914, that reform would not be widely achieved until after the First World War, and in some countries after the Second World War. The extension of male suffrage and democratization often took place in a continuing monarchical and aristocratic framework, but almost everywhere in Europe by 1914, some machinery of democratic self-government was being introduced. In addition, to counter the growing strength of socialism after 1871, and for humanitarian reasons, governments were also assuming responsibility for the social and economic problems arising from industrialism. The welfare state in its modern form began to take shape. Feldhound 81 France, the establishment of the Third Republic. In France, the Democratic Republic was not easily established, and its troubled early years left deep cleavages within the country. It will be recalled that in September 1870, when the empire of Napoleon III revealed its helplessness in the Franco-Prussian War, insurrectionaries in Paris, as in 1792 and 1848, again proclaimed the creation of a French Republic. A provisional government of national defense sought desperately to continue the war, but the cause was hopeless. By January 1871, a bitter siege of Paris came to an end and an armistice was signed. Bismarck, insisting that only a properly constituted government could make peace, permitted the election, by universal male suffrage, of a National Assembly that was to consider his peace terms and draft a constitution for the new French state. When the elections were held in February, it was found, as in 1848 and indeed 1797, that republicanism was so distrusted by the French people as a whole, and most especially in the provinces and rural areas, that a free election brought monarchist elements into power. Republicanism was still thought to be violent, bellicose in its foreign policy, turbulent in its political workings, unfriendly to the church, and socialistic, or at least egalitarian in its views of property and private wealth. The new assembly contained only about 200 Republicans out of more than 600 deputies. But the Paris Republicans, who had defended France when Napoleon III failed to do so, who for 4 months had been besieged, starved, and frozen by the Germans, and who still refused to make peace on the harsh terms imposed by Bismarck and about to be accepted by the Assembly, refused to recognize the latter's authority. A civil war broke out between the National Assembly, now sitting at Versailles, and the city of Paris, where a revolutionary municipal council, or commune, was set up. Paris, so lately attacked by German soldiers, was soon attacked again by the French soldiers of the new National Assembly. The Paris Commune. The Paris Commune, which lasted from March to May 1871, seemed to be another explosion of social revolution. Actually, it was in essence a revival of the Jacobinism of 1793. It was fiercely patriotic and republican, anti-German, opposed to wealthy bourgeois, aristocrats, and clergy, in favor of government controls of prices, wages, and working conditions, but still not socialist in any sweeping or systematic way. Among its leaders, however, there were a few of the new international revolutionary socialists who saw a new Jacobin or democratic republic as a step toward a future socialist society. Marx in England and others elsewhere hopefully read into the Commune the impending doom of the bourgeoisie. This was precisely what more conservative elements feared. To many of the French middle and peasant class, and to people like them all over Europe, it seemed that the communards were wild and savage destroyers of 19th century civilization. The fighting in Paris was atrocious beyond anything known in any preceding French Revolution. The communards, in final desperation, burned a number of public buildings and put to death the Archbishop of Paris, whom they held as a hostage. The armed forces of the National Assembly, when finally triumphant, were determined to root out the inveterate revolutionism of Paris. Some 330,000 persons were denounced, 38,000 were arrested, 20,000 were put to death, and 7,500 were deported to the French-controlled island of New Caledonia in the South Pacific. The Third Republic was born in an atmosphere of class hate and social terror. 608, 1082, the Bon Marché department store in Paris became a well-known example of the new large stores that began to displace smaller shops and independent merchants. The new commercial culture is evident in this late 19th century illustration of the store's vast expanse, proliferation of merchandise, and affluent shoppers. Department stores provided a safe meeting place for women, as well as lower prices for the many new products of the industrial era. Photo search, Getty Images. 609, 1083. The form of government for the new regime still had to be established. The monarchist majority in the assembly was itself evenly divided between those who favored a restoration of the Bourbon family and those who favored the Orleanist. The monarchists thus checkmated each other and, in effect, opened the way toward a new French Republic. Meanwhile, after extended discussion of various constitutional projects, the Assembly adopted in 1875 not a constitution, but certain constitutive laws. By a margin of 1 vote, a resolution indirectly amounting to the establishment of a republic was passed. The new laws provided for a president, a parliament in 2 chambers, and a council of ministers or cabinet headed by a premier. The 2 legislative bodies were to emerge from different electoral processes. The Senate was to be elected by a complicated and indirect system of election, the Chamber of Deputies by universal, direct, male suffrage. Within 2 years, in 1877, the role of the president, the ministers, and the parliament was further clarified as a result of an unsuccessful attempt by an early president, Marshall MacMahon, to dismiss a premier who had the backing of the chamber. MacMahon proceeded to dissolve the chamber and to hold new elections, but the example of Napoleon III's transformation of the Second Republic into an authoritarian regime was still fresh. The elections vindicated the principle of parliamentary primacy and of the responsibility of the premier and his cabinet to the legislature, especially to the more popularly elected lower house. The true executive in Republican France for a long time was not the president, who became a ceremonial figure, but the premier and the cabinet, themselves held strictly to account by a majority of the legislature. Unfortunately, that majority, in a parliament where a dozen or so parties were represented, was always difficult to form and could be created only by unstable shifting party alliances, coalitions, or blocs. No president, and indeed no premier, could henceforth dissolve the chamber in order to hold new elections, as could be done in Britain. Under the Third Republic, the substantial machinery of state, ministries, prefectures, law courts, police, army, bureaucracy, all managed by highly centralized control, was actually carried over virtually untouched, as in all upheavals since the time of Napoleon I. France in the 19th century, although volatile in appearance, in effect underwent less extensive governmental reorganization than any other leading country in Europe. Parliamentary primacy. Troubles of the Third French Republic, 1084. Yet the Third Republic was precarious. The government had changed so often since 1789 that all forms of government seemed to be transitory. Questions that in other countries were questions about specific government policies or party programs became in France fundamental questions of regime, monarchy versus republic. Many people, especially those influenced by the upper classes, the Catholic clergy, and the professional army officers, continued to harbor a deep aversion to the republic. On the other hand, the unmerciful and vindictive repression of the Commune made many middle-class people 6'10". This barricade and its defenders suggest the revolutionary fervor of the Paris Commune, which controlled the French capital in the spring of 1871. The Commune was in many respects a revival of revolutionary Jacobinism, rather than a precursor of social revolution, but it provoked intense fear and brutal repression from more oppression, 1085 more sympathetic to the Republicans. Many turned Republican simply because no other form of government established itself, or because it was the form of government that divided the country the least. As republicanism took in wider elements of society, it became less revolutionary and less fearsome. In 1879, for the first time, Republicans won control of both houses of the government. In the 1880s, their radicalism hardly went further than the founding of a democratic and compulsory school system at government expense, and the passage of anti-clerical legislation intended to curb church influence in education. Conservative forces in French society. Revolutionary images of radical men and women in the Parisian streets, as seen in this photograph, made the Paris Commune a symbol of political idealism and martyrdom for many socialists, and a symbol of dreadful social dangers for the middle and upper classes. Keystone France, Getty Images. For over a quarter of a century, however, Republicans had to defend the new Republican institutions in order to ensure the survival of the regime itself. An initial crisis arose in 1886 to 1889, when General Boulanger gathered around him an incongruous following that included Bonapartists, monarchists, and aristocrats, as well as various radical Republicans who wished a war of revenge against Germany, and even some workers who were disgruntled over their economic conditions. Boulanger became a popular figure and seemed for a moment about to seize power. But the menace collapsed in a 611, the Dreyfus Affair, 1086 comical failure as the general lost heart at the crucial hour and fled into exile. Meanwhile, in the 1880s and 1890s, scandals and revelations of corruption in high Republican circles provided ammunition for the anti-Republicans. Moreover, the hope that unsympathetic French Catholics would rally to the Republic, as urged by French prelates and by Pope Leo XIII in 1892, was shattered by the Dreyfus Affair, which in the late 1890s rocked the country and attracted wide attention outside France as well. This photograph of Alfred Dreyfus shows the French army captain after he was found guilty of treason in 1894. Stripped of his army rank and deported to prison on an island near French Guiana, his unjust conviction sparked bitter debates in France, a surge of anti-Semitism, and protracted legal campaigns that ultimately led to his complete exoneration and return to the French army. Hulton Archive, Getty Images. In 1894, a French military court found Captain Alfred Dreyfus, a Jewish army officer, guilty of treason for leaking secret military documents to the German embassy in Paris. Dreyfus was deported to life imprisonment at Devil's Island, but evidence accumulated to show his innocence and to indicate the guilt of another officer, Major Esterhazy, an adventurer known to be riddled with gambling debts. But the army refused to reopen the case, unwilling to admit it had erred. A staff officer, Major Henry, even forged documents to confirm Dreyfus's guilt. 1087. Meanwhile, anti-Semites, royalists, traditionalists, militarists, and most of the best people fought the reopening of the case, deeming it unpatriotic to shake the nation's confidence in the army and wishing also to disgrace the Republican regime. The partisans of Dreyfus stubbornly upheld him, both because they believed in justice and because they wished to discredit their anti-Republican adversaries. The country was deeply split into political and cultural factions that defended or attacked republicanism with arguments that repeated the bitter ideological conflicts of every French Revolution since 1789. Finally, following a passionate pro-Dreyfus campaign by writers such as Émile Zola, Dreyfus was pardoned by the French president in 1899 and granted complete legal exoneration in 1906. In the aftermath of the affair, leftist Republicans and socialists held power in the Chamber of Deputies and gained revenge by blocking the promotions of anti-Republican officers and by anti-clerical legislation. In 1905, in a series of laic laws, they separated church and state, unilaterally ending the close relationship established under Napoleon's Concordat a century earlier. All ties between church and state were severed. Priests and bishops were no longer to be paid by the state. Church property was taken over by the government, and Catholic laymen were to administer each parish. The Pope retaliated by excommunicating all deputies who had voted for these measures. Gradually, compromises were worked out. Some provisions were made less stringent, and tensions, if they did not disappear, at least eased. In 1089 revolutionary movements down to 1870 had been shown in France to be compatible with order, law, parliamentary government, economic prosperity, and a mutual tolerance between classes, to the extent at 613 least that they no longer butchered each other in the streets. Industrial workers were in many ways less well off than in England or Germany, but there were fewer of them. Despite its polarizing conflicts, Republican France gradually came to be viewed as a more peaceful country where painters, writers, scholars, and scientists flourished, where bankers, bourgeois, and well-established farmers could freely pursue their economic interests, a country living comfortably and unhurriedly on the savings of generations, and one in which, in close-knit family groups, average men and women could plan securely for their own and their children's future. Domesticating Republicanism 1090. But the comforts and values of bourgeois France were not those that would be needed for international leadership in the modern age of technology and industrial power. Though substantial economic progress was made, the country lagged behind Germany in industrial development. Politically, the fragmentation of political parties, itself a democratic reflection of a divided public opinion, and the distrust for historic reasons of a strong executive power led to the rise and fall of numerous short-lived ministries, no fewer than 50 in the years between 1871 and 1914. Ministerial instability was to be a chronic problem of the Third Republic, both before and after 1914. Continuity of government policy was, however, generally maintained because of stability in certain key ministries and because of the permanent civil service. French labor often expressed an enduring social and political discontent. Although French workers benefited from some labor legislation in the 2 decades after 1890, they continued to seek a more egalitarian, social republic. Socialist representation in the chamber grew, strengthening the anti-royalist factions in the French government. However, the most important single party of the Republic, the Radicals, or Radical Socialists, were in actuality radical Republicans, patriotic, anti-clerical spokesmen for the small shopkeepers and the lesser propertied interests. They drew the line at the advanced social legislation that labor expected from them, and on occasion their leaders even took strong action to prevent unionization and to suppress strikes. Because some of these radicals had started out as socialists, the distrust of French workers for all politicians, and even for political processes, was intensified. But the difficulties of the Republic went deeper. The political energies of France's Republican leaders had gone into liquidating the past, into curbing the political strength of the monarchists, the church, and the army. By the turn of the century, even before these older issues were fully resolved, the Republic was compelled to meet the challenge of labor and to face other domestic and international pressures that were to try it sorely. The Third Republic would weather the crisis of the First World War, but not that of the Second. The Radical Socialists, 614, 1-91. The British Constitutional Monarchy. The British constitutional monarchy in the half-century before 1914 was the great exemplar of orderly and peaceable domestic self-government through parliamentary methods. For over 60 years, 1837 to 1901, spanning 2/3 of the 19th century, Queen Victoria reigned as a constitutional monarch and gave her name to a distinguished era of material progress, literary accomplishment, and political stability. The two major political parties, Liberal and Conservative, the heirs roughly of the Whigs and Tories, took form in the 1850s, the former producing its great leader in William E. Gladstone, the latter, a series of leaders of whom the most notable was Benjamin Disraeli. The advance toward an egalitarian political democracy in Britain was more cautious and slower than in France. The Reform Bill of 1832 had granted the vote to about an eighth of the adult male population. The democratic Chartist agitation of the 1830s and 1840s attracted wide popular support, but failed to produce further reforms in the electoral system. In 1867, however, in response to continued demand for a wider suffrage, the second Reform Bill was passed, conservatives as well as liberals outdoing one another in an effort to satisfy the country and to win new political strength for their own party. The bill, adopted under Disraeli's conservative ministry, extended the suffrage from about 1 million eligible voters to about 2 million, or over a third of the adult males in the United Kingdom, reaching down far enough in income levels to include most workers in the cities. Disraeli's colleague Lord Derby called it a leap in the dark. In 1884, under Liberal auspices, the suffrage was again broadened, this time in the rural areas, adding some 2 million additional voters and enfranchising over 3/4 of all adult males in the country. Not until 1918 did Great Britain adopt universal male suffrage, as generally understood, and at that time, the long campaign for women's political rights gained at least a partial victory, when women over the age of 30 received the right to vote. The extension of suffrage, 1092. The leadership of the country at the turn of the century was still in the hands of men from the upper and wealthier classes. Until 1911, the government paid no salaries to members of the House of Commons, who therefore, in both political parties, were usually gentlemen with private incomes, possessing the same family background and education. The two parties alternated in power at regular intervals, each indulgent toward the other, carrying over and developing rather than reversing the policies of its predecessor in office. Both parties sought support where they could find it. The Liberals leaning somewhat more on the industrial and commercial interests, and the Conservatives relying more on the landed aristocracy, both sought and succeeded in winning their share of the new working class vote. The Liberals were usually the more willing to pioneer, the first of the four ministries of Gladstone being especially notable in this respect. Gladstone, in this first ministry, 1868 to 1874, developed the principle of state-supported public education under the Forster Education Act of 1870, introduced the secret ballot, formally legalized labor unions, promoted competitive examinations for civil service posts, reorganized the upper judiciary, eliminated the purchase and sale of commissions in the army, a form of property in office, and by abolishing religious tests, enabled persons who were not members of the Church of England to graduate from Oxford and Cambridge. The Conservative Party, less sensitive to pressure from business interests for a laissez-faire policy in economic matters, took the initiative in promoting new labor legislation. Under Disraeli's second ministry, 1874 to 1880, the existing acts regulating public sanitation and conditions in mines and factories were extended and codified. Safety measures were enacted to protect sailors, and the first attempt to regulate housing conditions for the poorer classes was initiated. But the Liberals, it must be added, sought to protect the workers' interests too. In Gladstone's second ministry, 1880 to 1885, for example, workers were assured of compensation for injuries not of their own responsibility, and Gladstone later campaigned to reduce labor hours and to extend employers' liability in accidents. Liberals and Conservatives 6-15 had a deep impact upon the Liberal Party, and indeed upon liberalism itself. The new Labour Party insisted that protective measures should be taken to counteract the poor health, low income, and economic insecurity. 1093 British political changes aware 1900. At the turn of the 20th century, after the long era of Liberal and Conservative ministries, important changes began to transform British political culture. Labour emerged as an independent political force, the Labour Party itself being organized shortly after 1900. The rise of Labour of British Workers. Facing this pressure from a politicized labor movement, the Liberals abandoned their traditional position of laissez-faire and sponsored a policy of government intervention and social legislation on behalf of working people. The Liberals, though they acted in part for humanitarian reasons, were aware that with the emergence of the Labour Party, workers who customarily had voted for them might readily transfer their allegiance. Rise of British Labour 1094. The Liberals, in control of the government from 1906 to 1916, with Herbert Asquith as Prime Minister and David Lloyd George as Chancellor of the Exchequer during most of this time, put through a spectacular program of social welfare. Sickness, accident, and old age insurance, and a degree of unemployment insurance were adopted, and a moderate minimum wage law was enacted. Labor exchanges, or employment bureaus, were established throughout the country. Restrictions on strikes and other trade union activities were removed. To meet the costs of the new program as well as of other government expenditures, Lloyd George's budget of 1909 called for progressive income and inheritance taxes. Wealthier taxpayers would be taxed at progressively higher rates. He was in effect advancing the then novel idea of using taxation to modify the social extremes of wealth and poverty. It was a war budget, he said, intended to wage war against poverty. Its fiscal measures were directed primarily at the landed aristocracy, and it aroused great opposition, especially in the House of Lords, where the contest over the budget led to a further constitutional curtailment of the power of the upper house. The Parliament Act of 1911 deprived the Lords of all veto power in money matters and of all but a 2-year delaying veto on action of the Commons on other legislation. At this time, too, the government voted to pay salaries to members of the House of Commons, making it possible for workers and others without independent incomes to take seats in Parliament. The Liberal Party was embracing a program of positive state intervention in social and economic matters that the older liberalism, nurtured on the doctrines of laissez-faire and the Manchester School, would not have accepted. With the Liberals actively seeking the support of labor and altering much of their traditional program, the Conservatives in the 20th century tended to become the party of industry as well as of landed wealth, and to replace the Liberals as the champions of economic liberalism and laissez-faire. In the next generation, after the First World War, the Conservatives were to remain one of the two major parties of the country. The Liberals were to be far outstripped by the Labour Party. State intervention. Meanwhile, despite its gains, labor was not pacified. Real wages showed a tendency to fall after 1900, and great coal and railway strikes broke out in 1911 and 1912. The British capacity to survive crises without violence, while still conspicuous, was being strained. An even more serious threat came from Ireland. 6116, One Town 95. The Irish Question. Britain suffered from one of the most bitter minorities conflicts in Europe, what the British called the Irish Question. After 1801, Britain was known as the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Ireland. The British government had incorporated Ireland into the United Kingdom as a defensive measure against pro-French sympathies in Ireland during the Wars of the French Revolution. But the Irish representatives who thereafter sat in Parliament were generally hostile to this incorporation and obstructionist in their tactics. The Irish had many substantial grievances, among which two were conspicuous. The Irish peasants were defenseless against their landlords, far more so, for example, than the French peasants before 1789. And the Irish people, though predominantly Catholic, were obliged to pay tithes to the established Church of Ireland, an Anglican sister church to the Church of England, which also owned a good deal of the land. 10 and 96, Sunday afternoon on the island of La Grande Jatte by Georges Seurat, French, 1859 to 1891. This picture of sunny calm, painted in 1886, conveys the well-being that many prosperous Europeans enjoyed or imagined in the late 19th century. The people portrayed here seem to live in a peaceable world that is far removed from social conflicts and from a later age of speed and mechanical amusements. Technically, this is one of the most remarkable pictures ever painted. The artist created it without the use of lines by filling the canvas with thousands of minute dots of the primary colors, which blur and mix in the eye to produce the forms, hues, light, and shadows of nature. The Metropolitan Museum of Art, New York, bequest of Sam A. Lewison, 1951. Gladstone, in his first ministry, disestablished the Church of Ireland. He also initiated measures to protect the Irish farm tenant. By 1900, under conservative auspices, Irish tenants were being assisted by the British government to buy out their landlords, often English or Anglicized, and absentee Irish landowners. The Irish also wanted home rule, or a parliament of their own. Gladstone, in trying to give it to them in 1886, split his Liberal Party, part of which went along with the Conservatives in opposing a political division of the British Isles. Home rule was finally granted to Ireland in 1914, but the Ulster Unionists, Protestants whose 617 ancestors had moved into Northern Ireland, mostly from Scotland, during the 17th century, objected vehemently to inclusion in an autonomous Ireland in which they would be outnumbered by the Catholics of the South. The latter, however, insisted with equal vehemence on the inclusion of Ulster, not wishing to see a political division of Ireland. Home rule. Real wages for British workers tended to fall in first decade of the 20th century, causing hardships for people such as these coal miners in Wales. Miners joined in strikes throughout Britain after 1910, contributing to economic and political crises that altered the older doctrines and policies of laissez-faire liberalism. Topical Press Agency, Getty Images. The Ulster Unionists, backed by British Conservatives, started arming and drilling to resist the Act of Parliament that authorized Home Rule. Great Britain, in 1914, was about to see a civil war on its own doorstep. It suffered from something like the insoluble nationalist disputes that 1097 afflicted Austria-Hungary. During the First World War, Home Rule was suspended. After considerable violence on both sides, Catholic Ireland, which for a time called itself Ire, received dominion status in 1922. But eventually, this Irish dominion dissolved all ties with Britain and became the Republic of Ireland. Northern Ireland remained in the United Kingdom and was dominated by Protestants, so that its Catholic minority continued to be an alienated, discontented population within the British state. The Irish question thus remained one of modern Britain's unresolved issues, generating bitter resentments and violent conflicts during all of the 20th century and beyond. 6/1/1898, Bismarck and the German Empire. 1871 to 1890. The German Empire, as put together by Bismarck in 1871 with William I, King of Prussia, as Kaiser, was a federation of monarchies, a union of 25 German states, in which the weight of monarchical Prussia, the Prussian army, and the Prussian landed aristocracy was preponderant. It developed neither the strong constitutionalism of England nor the recurring quest for democratic equality that was characteristic of France. To win popular support for his projects, Bismarck exploited existing democratic and socialist sentiment and provided that members of the Reichstag, the lower chamber, be elected by universal male suffrage. Remaining Chancellor of the United Empire for almost 20 years, from 1871 to 1890, he usually tried to have a majority in the Reichstag on his side, but he recognized no dependence on a majority in principle, holding to the doctrine that it was the emperor and his chancellor who were to govern the country. Moreover, in practice, the legislative powers of the lower house were severely restricted, and the upper chamber, representing the princes and not the people, and favored by the government, tended to be more important. Despite the nature of the empire, Bismarck's unified Germany at first displeased the Prussian conservatives, the East Elbian Junker landlords. They opposed his democratic concessions and were horrified when in 1872 he undertook to abolish what was left of their manorial jurisdiction over their peasants. Bismarck in the 1870s therefore leaned not on the conservatives, but on the national liberals. With their aid, he put through a number of economic and legal measures designed to consolidate the unity of the new empire. Bismarck's first serious conflict developed with the Catholic Church, at the very time that he was bent on subordinating all groups within the state to the sovereign power of the new empire. The Church had spoken out. In 1864, in the Syllabus of Errors, the Pope denounced the encroachment of all governments on educational and church affairs. In 1870, the new dogma of papal infallibility made it incumbent on Catholics to accept unreservedly the Pope's pronouncements in matters of faith and chronology of notable events. 1850, 1914, 1850 to 1940. About 60 million people migrate from Europe. 1869, opening of Suez Canal in Egypt facilitates global trade. 1870s, Western Europe and United States adopt the gold standard for global currency exchanges. 1871, the revolutionary Paris Commune is violently suppressed in France. 1890, Kaiser William II dismisses Bismarck and begins to shape policies of the German Empire. 1894 to 1899, Dreyfus Affair bitterly divides Republican and anti-Republican factions in France. C. 1900 European population reaches its highest percentage of world population. 1906 to 1916, liberal government in Britain introduces broad program of social welfare. 1914, opening of Panama Canal facilitates European trade in the Americas. Hintes 99 morals. To defend Catholic interests and those of the South, German states where Catholicism predominated, Catholic elements had organized the Strong Center Party, which now upheld the church pronouncements. In 1871, Bismarck launched the Kulturkampf, or Battle for Modern Civilization, to reduce Catholic influence within the new German Empire. The liberals joined in eagerly. Like 19th century liberals elsewhere in Europe, Gladstone's campaign against Anglican privilege and the French laic laws have been noted. They were strongly anti-clerical and disapproved of the influence of organized churches in public and private life. Laws were put through imposing restrictions upon Catholic worship and education. The Jesuits were expelled, and many Catholic bishops throughout Germany were arrested or went into exile. But Bismarck gradually concluded that the anti-Catholic legislation was fruitless, that he, 619, had overestimated the danger to the state of organized Catholicism, and that he needed the support of the Center Party for other parts of his program. Meanwhile, the country's rapid and spectacular industrial expansion had stimulated the growth of the German working class, and to Bismarck's alarm, socialism was spreading. The Catholic Church, 1100, the German Social Democratic Party, had been founded in 1875 by a fusion of Marxian socialists and the reformist followers of Ferdinand Lassalle on an essentially moderate program that Marx had denounced. But even a moderate socialism was mistrusted by Bismarck. He shared in the European horror at the recent Paris Commune. He feared socialism as anarchy, and he knew that socialism was in any case inherently republican, which made it a potentially revolutionary movement in an empire of monarchies. Two radical attempts on the emperor's life, in neither case by Social Democrats, provided him with all the excuse he needed. In 1878, having already made peace with the Catholics, he set out to eradicate socialism. Anti-socialist laws from 1878 to 1890 prohibited socialist meetings and socialist newspapers. For 12 years, socialism was driven underground. But repression was not his only weapon. He turned also to another tactic. Bismarck sought to persuade the workers to place their faith in him and the German Empire rather than in the profits of socialism. To that end, in the 1880s, he initiated an extensive program of social legislation. Workers were insured by the state against sickness, accident, and incapacity in old age. "Our democratic friends," said Bismarck, "will pipe in vain when the people see princes concerned with their well-being." In social insurance, Imperial Germany was, from whatever motives, years ahead of more democratic England, France, and the United States. Repression of socialism. 1101 Bismarck failed to kill socialism. The number of socialists elected to the Reichstag was greater in 1890 than in 1878. It seems, however, that Bismarck by the later 1880s was more apprehensive than ever of a social revolution that would destroy his empire, and he contemplated new actions by which the Reichstag might be throttled. He never reached this point, however, because in 1890, at the age of 75, he was obliged by the new emperor William II to retire. The German Empire, Eauer, 1890, William II. William first died in 1888 and was succeeded by his son Frederick III, who had been married for many years to the eldest daughter of Britain's Queen Victoria. Incurably ill of cancer, he died some 3 months after his accession. Frederick's son, William II, the last king of Prussia and the last German Kaiser, began his reign, 1888 to 1918, as a young man of 29, full of startling ideas about his personal power and privileges, somewhat in contrast to his father. He was also uncomfortable in the presence of an elder statesman who had made the German Empire, who had been his grandfather's aide and advisor, and whom he regarded partly with veneration and partly as an old fogey. William soon quarreled with Bismarck over continuation of the anti-socialist laws and over matters of foreign affairs. When Bismarck forbade his ministers to meet with the emperor on policy matters unless he was present, William resolved that he, and not Bismarck, would rule the empire. In 1890, William ordered Bismarck to resign, dropping the pilot, in the celebrated phrase. Under the 4 chancellors who succeeded Bismarck, it was William who dominated policy. William II. After 1890, Germany embarked upon what was termed a new course. In foreign affairs, this meant a more aggressive and ambitious colonial, naval, and diplomatic policy. In domestic affairs, it meant a more conciliatory attitude toward the laboring class. The 620-1102 anti-socialist laws were dropped, and the system of social security legislation was enlarged and codified. But no expansion of parliamentary democracy seemed possible. William II believed in the divinely ordained prerogatives of the House of Hohenzollern, and the empire still rested on the power of the federated princes, the Junkers, the army, and the new industrial magnates. But the Social Democrats, the Progressive Party, and other democratic forces were growing in strength. They demanded, for Prussia, a reform of the illiberal Constitution of 1850, and for the Reich, real control over the federal chancellor by the majority party in the Reichstag. In the election of 1912, the Social Democrats reached a new high by polling 4.25 million votes, about one-third of the total, and by electing 110 members to the Reichstag, in which they now formed the largest single party, yet they were excluded from the highest posts of government. The Imperial German political system, which Bismarck had created and which was now ruled by William II, was moving toward a constitutional crisis. But war came in 1914 and the political conflict was deferred. A new course. Developments elsewhere. General observations of political developments in other European states before 1914. Something has already been said in the preceding chapter. Italy had become a constitutional monarchy in the 1860s and completed its unification by the forceful seizure of Rome in 1870. Despite parliamentary reforms, Italian political life was characterized by unstable majorities and by opportunistic maneuvering and manipulation by moderate liberal political leaders who maintained themselves in office for long periods of time by shuffling and reshuffling political coalitions. The liberal leaders were anti-clerical, and the quarrel with the papacy over the seizure of the papal territories remained unsettled. The popes refused to recognize the Italian kingdom and forbade Catholics to participate in its affairs or even to vote in elections. Catholics voted nonetheless, and in 1907, bishops in each diocese were permitted to relax the ban, as they increasingly did. Political scene in Italy 1103. Industry had begun to expand in northern cities such as Milan, and the government gradually moved to extend the franchise to the working classes. The narrow suffrage of 1861 was broadened, first in 1882 and then in 1912, when a new reform increased the number of eligible voters from 3 to 8 million, or virtually universal male suffrage. Because of illiteracy and political inertia, not all of the newly enfranchised Italians hastened to exercise their voting privilege. The social problem remained serious too, despite some modest labor legislation. Poverty and illiteracy, especially in the agrarian South, were widespread, and radical unrest appeared in the industrial cities. The first manifestations of an anti-parliamentary ideology, chauvinistic nationalism, and explosive irrationalism appeared in the writings and political activism of literary men such as Gabriele D'Annunzio and Filippo Marinetti. The latter published in 1909 the manifesto of a radical new movement he called Futurism, which vehemently condemned all artistic traditions, celebrated the speed of modern technologies, and portrayed human violence as a kind of creative action. Such ideas would soon spread into politics, bringing a new irrationalism to Italian political culture and destabilizing Italian parliamentary democracy. In the dual monarchy of Austria-Hungary, created by the political compromise of 1867, Austria and Hungary were each informed constitutional parliamentary states. In theory, the Emperor King Francis Joseph ruled through ministries responsible to the legislature in each state. However, in matters affecting the empire as a whole, such as foreign affairs and military questions, there was little parliamentary restraint on the emperor. Here he had virtually final 621 Austria-Hungary Landenover authority. Moreover, in all matters he still had broad powers to govern by decree, which he exercised. As in Germany, the tide of socialism was held back both by repressive laws and by social insurance and benevolent legislation. The most serious problem in the empire remained the nationalist agitation by the various subject nationalities that were seeking more autonomy or their own sovereign states. This political agitation helped to deepen the new national self-consciousness among the Czechs and other Slavic peoples. Political democracy took a different course in Austria than in Hungary. In the former, partly as an effort to placate nationalist sentiment, universal male suffrage was introduced in 1907. In the latter, the expansion of voting rights was bitterly and successfully resisted by the Magyars, who saw suffrage as a weapon that could be employed by the Slavs to contest and destroy the Magyar preponderance. Austria itself, despite the democratic suffrage, was ruled very much like the German Empire, with the legislature able to debate and criticize, but not control policy. Kaiser William II's decision to remove Bismarck from his powerful position in Germany's government was widely described as dropping the pilot of the German Empire. This theme was conveyed by the British cartoonist John Tenniel, who portrayed William expelling Bismarck from the ship of state in this famous illustration for the British magazine Punch. Spencer Arnold, Getty Images. Of other countries, it can be said that the political forms of democracy showed signs of advancing everywhere, though women were still generally excluded from voting and from all public offices. Universal male suffrage was adopted in Switzerland in 1874, in Belgium in 1893, in the Netherlands in 1896, and in the next few years in Norway and Sweden. Norway was peacefully separated in 1905 from Sweden. In Southern Europe, besides Italy, 622 universal male suffrage was introduced in Spain, Greece, Bulgaria, Serbia, and after the revolt of 1908 in Ottoman Turkey. Even Tsarist Russia, after the revolution of 1905, received a Duma, or national parliament, elected on a wide franchise but on an indirect and undemocratic class basis, and 1105 with narrow powers. Among states west of the Russian Empire, only Hungary and Romania had a highly restricted suffrage on the eve of the First World War. The vote for women progressed more slowly. Women gained voting rights before 1914 only in certain western states of the United States, in Australia, New Zealand, Finland, and Norway. Not until after the First World War did female suffrage begin to make significant advances, and women did not gain the right to vote in France and Italy until after the Second World War. Democratic advances, 1106. The progress of representative and democratic institutions did not mean an end to the rule of monarchs, landed aristocrats, and other minority interests. For one thing, with the exception of France and Switzerland, Europe remained monarchical. Second, despite the growing importance of parliaments, parliamentary control over political life was far from guaranteed. Emperors and kings still ruled through their chancellors and prime ministers. Of the major world powers, it was mainly within the United States, Britain, and France that democratic and popular control was something of a reality, though political rights were still generally granted only to white men. But the extension of the suffrage, by the relaxation of property qualifications, had a dynamic of its own and was altering the framework of politics everywhere. Mass political parties, including socialist parties and confessional or religious-oriented parties, were replacing the older, narrow oligarchic political organizations, and support now had to be sought on a wider electoral basis. In almost all Europe, and in many of the outlying areas peopled by European descendants and immigrants, democracy was advancing, even within the older framework. By 1871, most European nations, with the notable exception of Russia, had written constitutions, guarantees of personal freedom, parliamentary and representative institutions, and limitations on absolutism. In the years between 1871 and 1914, the most significant new political development was the advance of male suffrage and the accompanying rise of new mass-based political parties. Expansion of the suffrage. The growing populations and economies of European nations thus created a social stability in which political institutions gradually became more democratic and more responsive to public opinion. Wealth and resources flowed into Europe from all parts of the world, so that the middle classes and even workers had more comforts and material goods than ever before, and more opportunities to participate in the political institutions of their various nations. Europe's dominant role in the global economy, the massive migration of European people, and the military power of European nation-states gave European civilization an extraordinary world influence in the decades after 1870. During these same years, however, the growing power of industrial corporations and capitalist financial institutions, as well as the traditional power of older European social hierarchies and cultural attitudes, also provoked opposition, which appeared in popular political movements as in socialism and in criticisms of European imperialism. The critics eventually influenced many people outside Europe, gaining a following wherever European economic and cultural institutions had appeared. European critiques of Western capitalism, traditions, and ideas therefore became another aspect of Europe's global influence at the end of the 19th century.